Can y'all hear me? Okay, here's my clicker. Okay, so I did teach at Ball State for several years, so I'm not used to like speaking and just being the only one speaking. So please, like, I hope you all did the readings before you come to class. And if you have questions as we go along, please, like, if it's a general question, let's hold it to the end. But if it's like a specific question about what we're talking about, especially if you think the person next to you has that question, let's please stop and ask. Okay, so today, clicker. Oh, so what do I have to put the clicker?
Is it no, is it on?
I don't know.
Left hand side, make sure it's on. Turn it the other way. Other way.
I'd say for next one and on.
Oh, left, you did say left. That's okay. Okay, so today I want to, here are the goals. I want to talk about a recent project I did in Lexington, nominating the former Lexington Hospitality Motor Inn to the National Register as a case study. So I'm going to go through the steps that I took to determine the National Register nomination eligibility. I also want to review the 7 factors of integrity and how I specifically looked at those factors in this project. Tips, like I did a lot of things wrong. I hope you don't make them too. And then if we still have time, and I have my clock here to make sure we don't go over, we'll try to look at some examples too. Okay, so this is the Lexington Hospitality Motor Inn. It's off of I-64. If you've been to Lexington, you may know it more recently as the Ramada Inn. It was constructed in 1968-69. It was advertised as an ultra-modern chain of resort-type inns. Its period of significance was from the time the construction started until 1979, when the ownership changed and it became a Harley Hotel. And after going through all this process, I decided that it was eligible under criterion C because it illustrated how certain events, so construction of new highways, growth of conventions, changing how Americans travel, and the types of facilities they prefer when they travel, it led to this new construction type, and I call it a resort-like urban hotel with a convention center. I made that up. We can talk about that later. So here it is, just a few weeks ago. It's in the process of being rehabbed back into a hotel. It sat vacant for a little bit. It has this central structure with like convention space and meeting space and the lobby, and it's attached to three different guest wings that are 2 to 3 stories in height. It kind of sits on a bit of a hill. In the interior of the courtyard, it still has lots of recreation spaces like an indoor pool, an outdoor pool, gathering spaces, shuffleboard courts, putting holes, that kind of stuff like that. Pool has seen better days, but it is still there. Lobby being used as storage. But it still does have these really great, almost floor-to-ceiling windows or wood ceilings in the central administration wing, so you can see how much light those windows originally let in. This is a convention space. While it was sitting vacant, there was a giant roof leak and it rained like a lot this spring, and so mold kind of took over and they had to tear up the carpet a few weeks ago, but it wasn't original carpet. And then it also has these really neat connectors between the administration wing and the guest wings with original wood panels, original railings, original staircases. More of these connectors. And the guest rooms are like, they're guest rooms. You know, like we've all seen these guest rooms before, right? But, okay, I'm going to come back to that. We've all seen these guest rooms, right? They did in 1968. Okay. Okay, so these are the steps I took. So first I did background contact research. I ID'd similar resources, compared them to similar resources, and then I finally reviewed the integrity. So when I did background resources, obviously I tried to do as many primary resources as I could. I looked through, I'm not joking, you know, like almost every single issue of the Lexington newspapers from the years prior to it opening for its period of significance, so I have a better understanding of what was going on in town, like why did there need to be this giant new hotel on the side of the interstate. Also a lot of publications related to tourism and conventions, so again I can understand what was going on in tourism. that led me into deciding I needed to dig more into these three topics. So I realized I really needed to understand why highways were being constructed, and therefore why there needed to be new highways constructed along these highways. So this is the hospitality motor inn. It's literally like right next to the ramp on the interstate. I also needed to understand more about growth of conventions, and I'll show you how I did that. Again, why there are more constructions, why there were hotels, because there are more conventions. And to keep track of all this, I did a lot of spreadsheets. Like, I love data. Like, I'm a nerd, you know, I like starting spreadsheets on my computer. So it really helps me, though, keep track of why resources are important, how they fit into their context. And so this is how I started to understand how the growth of conventions led to the need for more hotel space in Lexington, because you can see I highlighted at the very bottom, you might not be able to see it in the back. But in 1960, there were 63 conventions in Lexington, and I tracked that through newspapers. The newspapers did a really good job of actually announcing when there was a convention in town. Then in 1974, there were 224 conventions in town. So you can see a lot more conventions means there's not a lot more need for convention hotels, right? Another thing I did was I had a second spreadsheet where I tracked all of the hotels and motels that were built in Lexington in the 1960s. Because again, like for these recent past resources, you have to understand how they fit into this context. So I went through newspapers, city directories. City directories were a huge help. And also pamphlets from the library, and just tried to learn everything I could about every single motel and hotel that was constructed in Lexington in the 1960s. There were a lot, like there were dozens and dozens and dozens, but I felt like if I didn't understand every single one of them, I wouldn't be able to understand where my hotel fit into that context. Okay, so it's a big spreadsheet. After I did all this background research, it helped me to understand that all these things that were happening, new highways, more conventions, they're also affecting how Americans prefer to travel and the types of facilities they prefer to stay in when they did travel. And this forced the construction industry to build a new type of hotel. So before the 60s, this was one of the oldest hotels in Lexington, the Drake Hotel downtown. This was another old one, the Phoenix Hotel. So historically, before the construction of interstates after World War II, most of the hotels were downtown. They were big, grand structures. They didn't have a lot of parking. You could just pull up like you can today or last night when I got here. I just pulled up. There's not a parking lot. You couldn't do that. You had to park far away. You had to drag your luggage to the hotel. It was a very grand hotel. It was formal. It wasn't a place where kids could just run around and in their bathing suits. You know what I mean? Or hotels were single resident occupancy hotels. So you see that a lot too. A building will be called a hotel, even though it's really meant as short-term apartment situations for single people new to town. I also got into the history of motels. So how did a motel differ from a hotel? And why were these motels even not places that people even always wanted to stay when they traveled for conventions? And I have a story about my grandpa I can tell later. But so as I'm doing all this, again, it comes back to this idea that this new resource was emerging after World War II. And again, I called it resort like suburban hotels with convention centers. I came up with that name because I didn't have a name, right? What we had was hotel, motel. Well, as you can see, none of these resources that are called hotels and motels matched mine at all. So I needed to come up with a descriptive term that described my property, so I could better understand it in its context. And this is how it was originally. Tons of parking. As you can see, I didn't know this. I never thought about this, but until the 1960s, this idea of having lots of parking at your hotel, that was unheard of. So parking lots become significant features. kids to run around. These are all new ideas. Okay, so after I did all the context information, I also learned about the other hospitality motor inns that were built. And there were several of them that were built. And so I wanted to look at their level of integrity. I wanted to ID not only, so this is all the other hospitality motor inns that were constructed, mostly in the Midwest. But I not only ID them, I wanted to understand how they are today. And most of them have either been demolished or they have been so heavily altered that you can't see that it used to be a hospitality motor inn. Some of them have these new giant, new facades, or they've been so transformed that you can't even really tell it used to be a hotel. So again, that helped me understand that, okay, out of all the hospitality motor inns that were built, mine still had an integrity where the other ones didn't. I also wanted to better understand the other resort-like suburban hotels with convention centers in Lexington. So again, out of that huge list of hotels that were constructed in the 60s, I narrowed down which ones were the type of resource, the resort-like suburban hotel with convention facilities. So again, I listed out this is the National Register nomination, just a screenshot. So I listed out every single hotel and motel. Did they fit my contact? Did they fit my type or not? And of the ones that did fit my type, what was their integrity? Were they still there? Had they been heavily altered? Could you still tell it was a resort-like suburban hotel with a convention center? That's really long to say. And so that helped me answer the question, how common was this type of resource? More examples. So this again is showing, I listed out the National Register nomination, all of the hotels in Lexington that I consider to be a resort-like suburban hotel or convention center. How many conventions do they have? What is their integrity? Okay. So as I'm doing all this context research, I'm starting to understand that the resource that I'm looking at here is actually a pretty rare type of resource because of the integrity, which we have there now. The other properties that I was looking at, they didn't have all of these integrity factors intact nearly as much as mine did. So we all know the 7 factors of integrity, right? So location is a really important factor for my research, for this particular resource, because it wouldn't be in existence if there wasn't a highway. You're not going to have a resort-type suburban facility if you're not going to have a suburban area. Location was a really important factor, and it's still right next to, still the same place it was. The setting, also still very important historically. There were several other tourism and travel-related resources right at that intersection, like gas stations, restaurants, and they are still there today. Now let's get into design. So modifications were carried out of this building, of course. It's over 50 years old. It's unlikely that nothing would have changed. But I wanted to know, were there still enough historic design elements that still made it feel like a resort-like suburban hotel with convention facilities? So first, I had to think, well, what does that even mean? What do you have to have in a resort-like suburban hotel with convention facilities? What are the characteristics that define my type? And then I can decide, well, are those factors still there? For example, the footprint, still there. The footprint was really important. It had the central octagonal administration wing with all the restaurants, the gym, etc. The gym today, not back then. That's still there. The cantilever, porch. I can't say it. Thank you. Okay, little porch is still there. It has a different design today, has a different roof on it, but the idea is still there. Some of the other important design features are the circulation path, still there. You think about how we use hotels. You walk into, you park, okay? Then you walk into a door that's obviously giant front door, that's still there. You walk to the lobby space, still there. You walk around the rooms, walk around the layout of the hotel to get to your guest room, that all still exists. The lobby, so many things, some things have changed, but I don't think that the things that have changed really change the character of that space so much that when you walk in, you don't think, oh, this is the hotel, right? So the lobby is obviously, I mean, the check-in desk was obviously put in like around 2000-ish. That's when the Ramada Inn took over, the brand Ramada Inn. We think that they probably are the one who redid the lobby. So they put in new floors, they did put in a new check-in desk. The drop ceiling is not original. The giant chandeliers are not original, but they were probably put in like the 80s, and they are similar to ones that used to be there. They're the ones that used to be there historically had a more like Spanish revival feel, but they were definitely like these big, grand lighting fixtures. A lot of the other design elements that are still there that are original are this play of light and dark. Like I thought it really struck me when I first visited. The electricity was out. So I just kind of really on daylighting, and I was surprised at how much lighting. I thought, oh no, I'm not going to be able to get pictures, it's going to be so dark. But I was really surprised at how well lit it was. And it's really cool because when you go into the public spaces, they're very brightly lit with these giant windows. But then when you go into more public or private spaces like a convention center, they're very dimly lit. And then as you come out of like the very tiny like convention center, you go into the hall with all these giant windows and all this light, and it's very bright and it's very exciting. And so all of that play of light and dark is still there. All of the ways that they would bring the outside in are still there. Like there are these, okay, now they're filled with trash, but you can see on the left side, there are these really cool planters that are still there. And so as I started to look, like a lot of the things that make the hotel exciting were still intact. The things that make it feel like a resort, like I remember going through the Lexington newspapers, and the Lexington newspapers didn't use the word staycation, like that's a modern word, but that's what they meant. They were trying to get people from Lexington to come to their hotel in Lexington, and that was a totally new idea. You know, I'm sure they didn't make it up, but it seemed like it was a new idea, like, hey, you don't have to go out of town to have this exciting vacation. You can actually just come and stay here in town. So that was a new idea. And a lot of the design elements that made it feel like a fun resort-style place to stay are still there, like the pools and this cool outdoor bar that they had built. Okay, so I also then looked at the specific amenities related to a convention center. And again, I kind of put myself into like 1960 convention goer. Okay, so if you were going to this convention in the 60s, and we were going to a hotel in downtown Lexington, it would have been much more inconvenient. We would have had to park far away, not, a block or two away. We would have had to drag all of our things into the hotel. There wouldn't have been like an easy loading dock. Let's say you're having a big wedding, even, right? Like we've all experienced a giant wedding situation, and how easy it is when you do it at a convention center. There's all the resources there. There's the loading dock. There's like the back of the house place where you can have your staging area for all of your boxes and stuff. But that was a new idea at convention centers in the 60s. Oh, this is how the convention space looked before Florida had to get tore out this week. So then, of course, I also looked at the materials and the workshop and the workmanship. Some of the exterior and interior doors were original, some of them had replaced. Some of the all of the wood windows of the administration wing were original. And then I also, just kind of did a building inventory. What's original? What's not? In this picture here on the left, the flooring is not original, but that was okay with me. I mean, originally you had tile flooring. When you walk in, I don't feel like the new tile flooring takes away from the feel of that space. The railings are still there. The wood, like the feel of like subtle luxury is still there. did its physical form still read, still vibe, if you want to use a still modern term, did it still vibe hotel? And it certainly did. So it still, I was associated with the hotel, I thought. Okay, and then last I'm going to talk about feeling, which is an integrity factor that's kind of hard to define, right? But I think with these recent past resources, more and more feeling is becoming very important. You know, these recent past resources, they're meant to make us feel a certain way. Like the hotel, it wanted to make you feel like you were at a resort, even though you were in Lexington, Kentucky, on the side of an interstate. They wanted to make you feel like you're on vacation, right? Like you gotta go away someplace cool. So I really try to put myself in the mindset of a person using that resource in the 60s. When I walk in, does it still feel like it? Does it feel like a resort-style hotel? Yeah. Even though it's vacant, it smells like mold. It does. Does it still feel like a convention center? I mean, it does. It still has a loading dock. It still has a giant convention space. It still has the back of the house convention area where you do your organizing and your setups. So after I did all of this background research, looking at the factors of integrity, comparison to other resources, I decided, okay, this tells me there were only 3 other resort-like suburban hotels with convention facilities from the period of significance in Lexington. Of those 3, my building was the only one that retained enough historic integrity to explain what that resource type was from the 60s. So that's how I decided that yes, it was National Register eligible. Okay, so yay, that's why. So I decided it was eligible because it still had the historic feel, it was still close to the interstate, it still felt like a property that was built for the interstate to interact with interstate travelers. And it still had enough of the historic elements that it still allowed you to feel like you were going to a resort-like suburban hotel when you visited. Okay, so before I give a few tips, do you have any questions? You cannot believe that. Yes.
How did you first come up with an idea and look at this hotel or resort?
Someone called me and asked me, it was very practical. Someone, a developer called and said, I want to put this on the National Register so I can get tax credits. Do you think it's eligible? So I did some research.
I would not have ever thought in years that would be. But it was open in mind.
Right. And that's exactly what I'm going to talk about right here. Exactly, right? Okay, because like you were saying, like me, including myself, I do this too. Like we drive by structures and I will check. Oh, National Register eligible. Not National Register eligible. Like I prejudge. Okay, I shouldn't. And this is the West Virginia state capital. When we see these beautiful grand old buildings, we're like, oh, obviously that deserves to be on the National Register. Or, okay, this is my old house in Springfield, Ohio, little 1950s prefab. I always wondered what it would be like to live in a prefab. They're very chilly. But again, so I do a lot of Section 106 studies on this type of house. They're included in like surveys I have to do with Section 106. And I'm tempted to like prejudge. I'm like, well, siding's changed, windows have changed, front doors changed, everything's changed, it's not historic. I did my master's thesis on historic gas stations. And this was a few decades ago. But back then, we were still debating are gas stations eligible for the National Register? Because again, like we prejudge. But now we see this. It's on Route 66. This was the gas station that was the model for the Cars movie. So now we recognize these resources being National Register eligible, right? And then when it comes to more like high style recent past examples, we tend to look at these and we see the value in them because again they look pretty. Like this is the former Colorado Women's College in Denver. I had the honor of nominating that to the National Register. But again, it was a very high design building, like buildings that we might see downtown. Even this is Indiana State in Terre Haute. This was a little gem of a building. It was, I don't remember the name of the architect, he was an Indiana architect, but he based it off of a museum design at another college. So I think it's easy for us to understand how these high architect design properties are eligible for the National Register, or even like some of the roadside architecture, like this roadside architecture has been really popular lately to read about and write about and blog about and Instagram about. And so it's both hurting to myself. Okay, this is a note to myself. I'm going to confess about what I did here in a moment. It's not to prejudge, because okay, this was you asked me about how I become involved. This was the picture that the client sent me. Oh, I just bought this building in this hotel in Lexington, and here's an old. It's not a photo. It's just like a rendering and an architect did. And I live in Virginia, but my parents live in Evansville, and I drive that stretch of 64 a lot. And I had just driven by there like 2 days before, and I'm like, I don't remember seeing this. And so then I drove to it, and like I drove past it. And I was looking for it, I was not being a good architectural historian. I prejudged, and I was like, wait, this thing, So I would say that we tend to prejudge instead of looking at resources and understanding the value that they added when they were built. Determining what you're going to call it, right? That was really hard, and actually Marty in the SHPO office really helped me with this, because I knew I couldn't just call it a hotel. That was way too big. There were so many hotels that were nothing at all like my property. So I had to come up with a name that wasn't in any architectural history books, but I needed that name so that I could compare it to other similar resources. Could I compare apples to apples? Because otherwise I was comparing apples to oranges, to steaks, to onions, and it just didn't make sense. Ads are awesome. They really helped me understand how this property was valued at the time, how contemporary travelers viewed hotels like this. So remember, this is what I saw. I guess I draw by, and go ahead.
This is one of the cities you drove by on 64.
This is, so 64 actually sits above the exits. The ramp for 64 sits above the VP. So I have gotten off the ramp, and now I'm just getting ready to drive into the hotel off of the ramp. So, what was my point here? Oh, yes, okay. So this is what I saw, right? Something that's worn down, needs some repairs. But the ads helped me to understand better how people viewed it back then. So in the 60s, ads were telling me that this was considered Lexington's finest new hotel. Even though to me, it just seemed like a Ramada Inn on the side of the road, like I stayed in under a price. But back then, it was something new and exciting, and it might be hard to read some of these thoughts. This is where hospitality begins, the lobby, soft boards, soft carpets, luxurious decor, the way your reservation is handled promptly. Planning a sales meeting? Call us. We have the space for you. Just one of our 158 hospitality rooms, spacious, tastefully decorated, beautifully appointed. To us, maybe this seems normal, but back then it wasn't, and no one else was doing these ads. No one else was advertising fun and relaxation for everyone. They were trying to get everyone in Lexington to come, join, swim in the pool, come, play in the play area. They even had like a family pass. If you lived in Lexington, you could pay an annual family pass. Like today, we do at the lunch clubs, right? They had the same idea here for a hotel. I started to understand too that back in the 60s, people went to hotels for entertainment on Friday and Saturday nights, right? That's something we don't do today. so I started to look at how that compared to other hotels and motels in Lexington. Some of them, like this ad is for another motor lodge in Lexington. And you can see how this ad totally differs from the Lexington Finest ads that were for the hospitality motor inn. This one is all about convenience, comfortable bed, reasonable rates. So the ads really help me to understand how to place that building into its context. Something I also try to do is I try to take myself back in time as much as I can, especially with these more recent past resources. Now, I am very lucky. I have a grandpa who is going to be 101 in 2 weeks. And so I actually talked to him about this resource. It's like grandpa. He's like travel everywhere, okay? And for a long time, he sold insurance for National Life Insurance. And they would have these big conventions. And I was like, did you ever go to the hospitality motor inn? No, but he went to similar ones in Indianapolis. And he told me the story about how he used to take my grandmother on these business trips, and they would have to stay at places like this, or like this. I like this one because that green car reminds me of his car, so I can see him sitting here. Okay, and my grandmother, her name is Bubba, and she was quite grumpy and snarky in particular. And Grandpa would bring Bubba on these trips, and she didn't like it because she didn't have anything to do. Maybe there was a pool, there was a little bar, there was no restaurant, okay? That she just had like sit in a hotel room, and that was it. But then, once these new resort-style suburban hotels with convention centers came along, that was totally different. Because here, if they stayed here, you had to take the car, right? You had to take the car and drive to the convention center. But once we started staying in these new types of hotels, she could go, he could spend the day in the convention center, she could spend the day in the pool, in the restaurant, and at the bar, she had plenty of things to do, to hang out, and enjoy her time while he was doing his work. So for me, that really helps if I can try to put myself into the place of the people who were using that resource when it was built. Okay, and these last two tips are things that were brought up as I was presenting this project to different groups at the local level and at the state level. So these last two tips are things that people brought up in the meetings. And I might have said something snarky at the time, so I publicly apologize for the snarky lie I'm sure I gave at the time. But they're actually really good points. The first point was, well, I'm having a hard time understanding how this hotel is historic because I've passed it every single day of my life. I grew up down the street, I pass it every day. This can't be historic because that means maybe I'm historic. And I get it. Like, I was born in 1978, and so I started thinking about all the places around my parents' neighborhood that were brand new when I was a kid. I'm like, oh, these places are historic. And then I started thinking how they've changed, and how we don't use them as the same anymore. So, like, you were asking how I got involved with this project. Well, this project has really made me look at the resources in my neighborhood differently. Seeing things in a different light. Okay, so one of the questions that was brought up was, well, if, these hotels, these side-of-the-highway type of hotels are going to be National Register eligible, does that mean that Taco Bells are going to be National Register eligible too? Now, at this particular meeting, someone brought up Taco Bell. At other meetings, people have asked me about McDonald's. At other meetings, people have asked me about drive-thrus, so it seems like this is something that we should talk about because whether someone asks me about Taco Bell or another sort of resources, it's always brought up at every single meeting. Okay, so could a Taco Bell be National Register eligible? And I haven't been to Taco Bell in a long time. Okay, but I loved the Taco Bell when I was a high schooler. This was my Taco Bell in Evansville, Indiana, on Green River Road by Easton Mall. Okay. And I can remember sitting in trigonometry class when I was a freshman in high school, and I was thinking all the other girls were so cool because they were older than me, and they could drive to Taco Bell after school. Okay, and I remember very distinctly going through the drive-thru of Taco Bell, when I was a kid, when I was in high school. And I was home a few years ago, and I was like, Brandy, let's go to the old Taco Bell. And it's now a different Mexican restaurant. And they've done a really cool job inside, like, they really decked it out, and it's like, it is so cool. It's really, really cool. It's not Taco Bell, you know. When you walk in, there's no, the way you use the building is different. You know, you don't walk in, I'm gonna start out. We all know what a fast food restaurant looks like, right? Like, you walk into the door, and the architecture, like, forces you towards the line, right? And you stand there in front of the board with your mouth open, and you pick up what you want to eat, right? Well, that's all gone. Now it's like a sit-down restaurant. So the way the building is used has changed. The board's gone. That's all changed. The drive-through isn't a drive-through anymore. But then I would say there are also Taco Bells that do really feel like an old Taco Bell. I haven't been to this one. I lived in California for a long time. I haven't been to this one. This is in Santa Barbara. When I was doing research for this project, I just happened to come across this one. Apparently, the building owners recently applied for landmark designation, and they were denied. And I find that interesting. I wasn't there, you know, so I guess I can't speak on my opinion of it. But to me, this still feels like a Taco Bell. Like, this still feels like, you know, the old style Taco Bell that had this influence on Spanish Revival architecture, or this. I lived in Santa Cruz for a while, and this was downtown. This is a very popular place to hang out downtown. We just recently closed it, but it also still really felt like an old Taco Bell. I mean, it still had the faux tile roofs. It still had a lot of the nods to Southwest architecture. It has this really cool patio area that's been enclosed, I guess, almost since the Taco Bell was built. You can tell, like, the bottom half has been changed over the years, but it's always had like this patio area, this like gathering space area. So I think Taco Bell could be on the National Register, but I think like I just went through all my presentation. Maybe it could be on the National Register if you did the context research and you found why it was important, and you found why it still has integrity, and if it still has that association, that feeling of a resource from the recent past. Okay, so that was a lot, and that is exactly 45 minutes. So, are there any questions? Yes, sir.
Yeah, I'm curious, you've obviously had talked to the CLG in Lexington about this. What's their reaction then?
No, I didn't work with the CLG.
Because they have to vet this, right, before it goes to SHPO?
So, Lexington does have a board of, I forget the exact name, architectural review. But they also have another board which only deals with National Register nominations. And so I had to go before that board.
But they were supportive of this?
Yes. Question? No. Okay.
Restaurants, so this never had its own restaurant, everything's catered for banquets?
It did have a restaurant. The kitchen is all still there, just like it was. The space that was a restaurant is now the breakfast area. So it had changed in that it used to have like built-in banquettes, and those are all gone, and now it's just like freestanding table and chairs. But the space itself is still there.
It's being used for a hotel today.
They are currently being patioed to be a hotel, yes.
Did they find photographs of the original interior finishes?
We found a few. I found one brochure from shortly after it was open. It was in the archives of the library, and it did show some of the finishes on the inside of the rooms, but they were pretty plain. They were just pale colored walls. Other questions?
I can't believe I'm going to ask this, but I'm taking a shot.
Okay.
So this property that looks good, I recently saw. I love the property. The building is usable, but it's got one of those, I think from the early 19
We need to understand these properties before we can say they're National Register
All right,
eligible.
Patrick maybe knows that roof.
Okay, yes.
Typically, those are called folded plate roofs and were a feature of mid-century modernism.
Yes.
Often done with reinforced concrete, but then later buildings gave up the reinforced concrete.
Yes, so this roof never had reinforced concrete, it was always frame.
So, I mean, yeah, but what I'm asking, I mean, I didn't know what to call that roof, but I mean, that's kind of the same, isn't that the same kind of?
Lexington does have a lot of those like corrugated, the roofs. the
Is that,
folding.
I mean, do you think that would even be considered? I mean, that's why.
Well, there again, I'm trying to stress, like, we can't say this it is or isn't. I'm trying to say, like, we need to do research, we need to understand, like, this particular building is not eligible for the National Register under criteria A for architecture. So then, therefore, it's very difficult for me to look at a photo or visit a building and say, oh, well, yes or no, because visual assessment, that's A. I mean, I wouldn't have understood any of, this is eligible under C, Association of Events. I wouldn't have understood any of that without doing the research. I wouldn't understand any of that without just looking at it. Does that make sense? So like, it's hard for me to say, oh, well, a certain style of building or like a certain construction method is automatically eligible for the National Register. I mean, you really have to look at it as an individual case study.
Yeah, I mean, I would be shocked if it was, but then,
Yeah.
you know, I'm just like the other question, I'm shocked that this was, you know, so I have a new way of looking.
Well, I think maybe perhaps part of my point is that some of these everyday resources, these resources that aren't designed by hired architects, they're still eligible for the National Register because they still tell the story of how we live.
It's cultural.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly right. Exactly. Yes.
Isn't that called boogie architecture?
Googie is a style that might be associated exactly with what she's talking about. Right. Other questions? Yes.
I don't have a question, but more of a comment. I think this is probably as a younger person in historic preservation, and I say that in my mid-30s, where perspective from younger generations is more important, because I was at the review board meeting for this, and to me, looking at it, like, to me, I think, yeah, sure, this, even architecture to me looks like, yeah, this could be something that's so unique compared to the hotels that are being built today.
And I think that's interesting because I'm only 10 years older than you.
Yeah.
And like when I drove by, I'm like, well, it looks like something I stayed at 100 times with my grandparents, you know? And that was wrong. So I'm glad that you did look at it and enjoy it, I'm excited about it. Yeah.
Well, and that's what made me, I thought it was a terrible.
Oh,
But my son was like, what are you talking about? Of course, you know, he's 35, so he's looking at it going, this is iconic.
Yeah.
And I'm like, what?
right.
So
Well,
when
that's
that,
my perspective, yeah.
yeah, I just was like, well, tear us up. Yeah.
So forgive me, this is obvious here. Did your hospitality order get on the national?
Yes, yes, ma'am.
You
Yes.
said that, but I somehow forget it. And is that a picture?
Yes. Yes, ma'am. Yes, being rehabbed right now.
Yes.
Other questions? Yes.
I just wanted to thank you for opening up the audience mind. And I think you mentioned that you felt historic. I'm dealing with that. So, I was born in 1955, and my parents and I went to several. So, it's very difficult to look at something that you remember when you were little as being historic.
Yeah, the other day I was thinking about grocery stores. Like, remember how, like, when I was a kid, it was a brand new grocery store was built down the street from me, and it's so small. Like, it's still there, and it's so small. And I was thinking about how, like, even the way we shop for groceries has changed over time, and all these places that I went to as a kid, they're now 50 years